after a major earthquake condemns your building and emergency services tell you to shelter in place, but your home isn't safe. You face a terrifying reality. Hotels are full or damaged, your car won't cut it, and you don't know how to create real shelter. Most people think shelter is just having a roof overhead, but here's the truth that could save your life. Your body loses heat 25 times faster when wet, and you can die from hypothermia in 50-degree weather if exposed to wind and rain. Shelter isn't about the structure itself. It's about creating a microclimate around your body that prevents deadly heat loss from wind, precipitation, and cold ground that can kill you in hours. The absolute first rule of emergency shelter that everyone gets wrong is location, location, location. And this is where most people's plans completely fall apart because they're thinking about comfort and convenience instead of the factors that will actually keep them alive through the night. You need to avoid low-lying areas where cold air settles and water collects because that depression that looks flat and comfortable will become a freezing pool of misery when temperatures drop overnight. And stay away from dead trees, loose rocks, and anything that could fall on you, because getting crushed in your sleep by a widowmaker branch is a really stupid way to die when you're trying to survive a crisis. Look for natural windbreaks like rock formations, dense vegetation, or terrain features that block prevailing winds, because wind chill can drop the effective temperature by 20 or 30 degrees, turning a manageable situation into a life-threatening one. Here's something most folks never consider about shelter building that separates people who make it from people who don't. You need to think in layers, exactly like you do with clothing, because a single-layer shelter will fail you in multiple ways that compound each other. Your ground insulation layer is actually more critical than your overhead cover in most situations because the ground conducts heat away from your body incredibly efficiently. And you'll be cold and miserable even with a perfect roof if you're sleeping directly on frozen earth. Pile up leaves, pine needles, moss, or anything dry to create at least 6 to 8 inches of insulation between you and the ground. And more is always better when it comes to ground insulation because this isn't an area where you can compromise without suffering the consequences. If you have any kind of foam pad, tarp, or even cardboard that goes on top of your natural insulation to create an actual vapor barrier that prevents moisture from the ground from soaking through and destroying your insulation's effectiveness. But here's the thing about overhead shelter that blows my mind because it's simultaneously way simpler and way more complex than most people realize. You don't need 4 walls and a traditional roof to survive. You just need something that sheds water and blocks wind, while trapping a layer of warm air around your body. And the simplest effective shelter is a lean-to that takes maybe 30 minutes to build if you know what you're doing and have even minimal materials to work with. You find or create a ridgepole between 2 trees or supports. Then you layer branches, leaves, bark, or any available material at a 45 to 60 degree angle so water runs off instead of soaking through. The key is making your covering layer thick enough. And most people fail here because they think a few branches will do the job. But you actually need 12 to 18 inches of debris to create effective waterproofing and insulation that will keep you dry and warm through the night. For urban collapse scenarios where you're working with manufactured materials instead of forest debris, plastic sheeting and tarps become absolutely critical resources that multiply your shelter options dramatically. A single 10 by 12 foot tarp can create a dozen different shelter configurations depending on your specific needs and available anchor points. And knowing these configurations before you need them is the difference between struggling for hours in the dark and having shelter up in 15 minutes. The A-frame tarp shelter is incredibly wind resistant and sheds water effectively because you're creating a tight-pitched roof that doesn't catch wind or collect water. And you can make it as small as necessary to conserve heat by trapping warm air in a smaller space. While the diamond fly configuration gives you way more coverage and protection from multiple angles, but it requires more anchor points and works better when you have trees or poles to work with rather than trying to build it in an open area. Here's what nobody tells you about tarp shelters that makes them work way better than they should. You need to tension everything properly, and I mean tight enough that the fabric doesn't flap or sag, because loose sections create noise that will drive you crazy, collect water that will drip on you all night, and catch wind that can tear your whole shelter apart. Use trucker's hitches or taut line hitches that let you adjust tension as your cordage stretches or weather conditions change, and carry actual paracord or bank line instead of cheap rope that stretches and weakens when it gets wet. The SOL Escape Bivy weighs only 8.5 ounces and provides an incredible emergency shelter option that breathes while reflecting your body heat, keeping you warm in conditions that would otherwise kill you while taking up almost no space in your emergency kit. The debris hut is what folks in survival situations have been building for literally thousands of years, and it works incredibly well when you construct it properly with enough material and the right internal structure. You're essentially building a human-sized nest that uses trapped air and natural insulation to keep you warm even in freezing conditions, and this shelter can be built with absolutely nothing except what you find in the woods around you. Start with a ridgepole that's about 1.5 times your height, propped up at a 30 to 40 degree angle with one end on the ground and the other supported by a tree or forked stick. Then you add ribbing along both sides of your ridgepole, creating a framework that looks like a skeleton fish or the frame of a tiny house. And here's where most people completely mess this up and end up with a shelter that doesn't work. You need to pile debris at least 3 to 4 feet thick on all sides except your entrance, because anything less won't provide adequate insulation to keep you warm when temperatures drop at night. But here's something that catches people completely off guard about debris shelters. You need to stuff the inside with dry leaves or pine needles too, creating a nest that you literally burrow into like a hibernating animal, because the airspace inside needs to be filled with insulation that surrounds your body. And the smaller you make your interior space, the warmer you'll be, because you're heating less air with your body heat. Though you need enough room to avoid claustrophobia and to be able to shift positions without destroying your shelter from the inside. The entrance should be small, barely large enough to crawl through, and you want to be able to plug it with a stuff sack full of leaves or a backpack to trap heat inside once you're settled for the night. Snow shelters are incredibly effective when you're dealing with winter conditions and have enough snow to work with, because snow is actually an amazing insulator that indigenous peoples of the Arctic have relied on for countless generations. A properly built quinsy or snow cave can maintain internal temperatures of 20 to 30 degrees warmer than outside, even in extreme cold, because you're using the insulating properties of snow combined with your body heat in an enclosed space. But here's what's absolutely critical that can kill you if you get it wrong. You must have ventilation holes to prevent carbon dioxide buildup that can cause you to lose consciousness and die in your sleep. And these holes need to be maintained throughout the night, because they can close up as snow drifts or as moisture from your breathing freezes. Keep a stick or pole that reaches from your sleeping area to the outside so you can poke through and verify your vent hole is open without having to dismantle your shelter in the middle of the night. Building a quinsy is way easier than most people think, because you're not carving into a hillside like you do with a snow cave. You're just piling up snow and letting it sinter for a few hours before hollowing it out. Pile your snow at least 6 to 7 feet high in a dome shape, and this is going to take a lot of shoveling if you're working alone, but the result is absolutely worth the effort when you're facing sub-zero temperatures. Let the pile sit for at least 2 hours so the snow crystals bond together through a process called sintering that makes the structure way stronger than freshly piled snow would be. Then you hollow out the inside, leaving walls that are 12 to 18 inches thick, which you can measure by pushing sticks through from the outside as reference markers so you don't accidentally break through while you're digging. Here's something most folks never consider about improvised urban shelters when you're dealing with a collapse scenario in a city environment. Vehicles can serve as temporary shelter, but they're terrible for extended stays because they're metal boxes that turn into ovens during the day and freezers at night, conducting heat away from your body incredibly efficiently. If you have to use a vehicle for shelter, you need to add insulation by covering windows with blankets, sleeping bags, or even newspaper to create dead air spaces that trap heat. And crack a window slightly for ventilation, because carbon monoxide poisoning from running the engine for heat has killed countless people who thought they were being safe by staying warm in their cars. Abandoned buildings seem like obvious shelter choices during urban collapse, but they come with serious risks that you need to evaluate carefully before you commit to staying there. Structural damage might not be immediately obvious, and buildings that look fine can collapse hours or days after an earthquake or explosion due to weakened support structures. Check for obvious cracks in walls and foundations, listen for creaking or shifting sounds, and smell for gas leaks that could cause explosions if you light a fire or candle. Choose upper floors to avoid flooding and to make it harder for people to get to you, but never go so high that you can't escape quickly if the building becomes unstable or dangerous. The psychological aspect of shelter is something that gets completely overlooked in most survival discussions, but it's incredibly important for maintaining your mental health and decision-making ability during extended crises. Your shelter becomes your safe space, your psychological anchor when everything else is chaotic and uncertain, and having a place that feels secure and protected makes an enormous difference in your ability to cope with stress and fear. Make your shelter as comfortable as possible given your circumstances, because small touches like arranging your space thoughtfully, keeping it clean, and creating some sense of home will boost your morale way more than you'd expect. Here's what blows my mind about shelter that most people never think about until it's too late. You need to plan for sanitation from the very beginning, because living in your own filth will destroy your health and morale faster than almost anything else. Designate a bathroom area at least 200 feet from your shelter and any water sources, and dig a cat hole that's 6 to 8 inches deep for solid waste. If you're staying in one place for more than a few days, you need a proper latrine with a deeper pit and some kind of privacy screen, because maintaining dignity and hygiene becomes absolutely critical for psychological well-being when you're living in primitive conditions. Fire management near your shelter is absolutely crucial for warmth, cooking, and psychological comfort, but it's also incredibly dangerous if you don't set things up correctly from the start. Your fire should be close enough to your shelter to provide heat, but far enough that sparks can't set your shelter materials on fire, which typically means 8 to 10 feet minimum distance depending on wind conditions and what your shelter is made from. Build a reflector wall of rocks or logs on the opposite side of your fire from your shelter to bounce heat back toward you, literally doubling the effective heat you receive from the same fire. And here's something that catches people off guard. Green wood or wet materials placed in your fire will create way more smoke than heat, which drives you out of your shelter area while also signaling your location to anyone nearby who might want to investigate or take advantage of your situation. Group shelters make way more sense than individual shelters when you're with family or a team, because you're sharing body heat, pooling resources, and providing mutual security that makes everyone safer and more comfortable. But here's the thing about group shelters that's absolutely critical. You need way more space than you'd think, because bodies put off moisture that will soak everything if your shelter isn't big enough for proper ventilation. Figure at least 3 feet of sleeping space per person, plus room for gear, a small fire if you're going with a longhouse design, and enough height that people aren't constantly hitting their heads on the roof structure. The work of building a larger shelter is definitely worth it, because keeping your group together maintains morale, allows for guard rotations if security is a concern, and means you only need to maintain one fire instead of multiple smaller ones. Tool selection for shelter building makes an absolutely massive difference in how quickly and effectively you can create protection from the elements. And having the right tools means the difference between struggling all day and having shelter up before dark. A good saw beats an axe for most shelter building, because you're making precise cuts to create framework rather than splitting firewood. And a folding saw like the Baco Laplander weighs almost nothing while cutting through 6-inch branches in less than a minute, while a multi-tool or fixed blade knife handles detail work and shelter adjustments that a saw can't manage. Cordage is absolutely essential, and you need way more than you think. So carry at least 100 feet of paracord or bank line at all times, because you'll use it for everything from lashing poles together to hanging tarps to creating clotheslines for drying gear. Here's what nobody tells you about long-term shelter that separates surviving a few days from actually maintaining your health and functionality for weeks or months. Your initial emergency shelter needs to evolve into something more substantial if you're going to be staying in one place for an extended period because temporary solutions break down, weather degrades materials, and your physical and psychological needs change as the situation continues. Upgrade your shelter gradually by adding a better roof, improving insulation, creating a proper entrance that keeps weather out, and building storage areas for food, water, and gear, while also thinking about drainage around your shelter because a single heavy rainstorm can flood you out if you haven't created channels that direct water away from your sleeping area. Seasonal considerations are absolutely critical because shelter requirements change dramatically based on weather conditions, and you need to adapt your strategies accordingly. Summer shelters focus on ventilation, shade, and insect protection because overheating and bug bites will make you miserable way faster than cold will, while winter shelters prioritize insulation, wind protection, and heat retention above everything else. Spring and fall create unpredictable conditions where you might face hot days and freezing nights, requiring versatile shelter designs that can be opened up for cooling or buttoned down tight for warmth. And you need to position summer shelters to catch breezes while placing winter shelters to block wind, which often means you're looking for completely opposite terrain features depending on the season. Community shelter building is way more effective than trying to do everything yourself because pooling skills, labor, and materials creates better results for everyone involved while building the social connections that become incredibly valuable during extended crises. Organize work parties where different people handle different aspects of shelter construction based on their skills and physical abilities. And don't fall into the trap of thinking you need to do everything yourself, because that individualistic mindset will exhaust you and create inferior shelters compared to what coordinated groups can accomplish. Teaching others while you build creates knowledge redundancy, so the group isn't dependent on any single person, and it builds the kind of community resilience that helps everyone survive and maintain their humanity during difficult times. So there you have it. Everything you need to know about building actual survival shelter that will keep you alive and functional when normal housing isn't available and you're facing nature or urban collapse on its own terms. And the key thing to remember is that shelter isn't about building the fanciest or most complicated structure. It's about understanding the principles of heat retention, weather protection, and location selection that make any shelter work effectively. Start learning these skills now by practicing in your backyard or on camping trips where the stakes are low and you can make mistakes without serious consequences. Build different types of shelters in different seasons so you understand how they perform in various conditions and what modifications work best for your climate and situation. Because most importantly, remember that shelter knowledge is way more valuable than any amount of gear because you can lose or break equipment, but the skills and understanding you develop stay with you forever and can be applied with whatever materials you find around you. Connect with other preparedness-minded people in your community who can share knowledge and skills while providing mutual support when things get difficult. Practice, test, refine, and build the confidence that comes from knowing you can create effective shelter under adverse conditions with limited resources. Because the goal isn't to become some kind of wilderness hermit who's hiding from society. It's to develop the competence and resilience that lets you protect yourself and help others when normal infrastructure fails, and people need practical solutions more than they need panic. When you know how to build real shelter, you face displacement and homelessness with capability rather than fear, and that changes everything about how you respond to crisis situations. So if this video gave you practical knowledge you can actually use when things go wrong, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell because I've got tons more survival content coming that will build your skills and confidence no matter what challenges you face. And share this video with anyone who needs to understand that shelter is a skill set you can learn rather than something you either have or you don't, because the more capable people we have in our communities, the better we'll all handle the disruptions and crises that are increasingly part of our world.